Hi everyone, happy Earth Week. Today at March for Science, we are continuing the celebration with our Day of Democracy. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ingrid Paredes and I am the Satellite Director for March for Science, as well as the co-chair of the March for Science New York City Satellite. And I'm super excited today that we're joined by my co-chair, scientist, activist, my very good friend, Omar Gowayed. And today we're going to be talking about his personal science advocacy journey, as well as how we became satellite organizers with March for Science. So yeah, Omar, welcome to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thanks for inviting me to the virtual stage.
Yeah, so, I'm always super. Oh, go ahead.
No, yeah. I like that, like, intros for me and you is just basically like, oh, just copy and paste Ingrid's intro. That's my intro.
Yeah, so Omar and I, which we'll talk about over the course of the conversation, we actually go to the same institution for our PhDs right now, except he's in materials chemistry and I'm in chemical engineering. But we'll get there. We'll get to the bit of the backstory. But before that, Omar, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself? You've always described yourself to me as someone who's been like a lifelong activist. I think like your tagline is protesting out of the womb, which I've always enjoyed introducing you as. But how did you get your start? How did you really start developing your voice?
Okay, so I guess I'm an Egyptian American who grew up in Alabama. So that's sort of, I was born in North Carolina, grew up in Alabama. My family, when they came to the US, they were super excited about the concept of democracy and human rights. So like that to them was really exciting. My dad was actually really disappointed when I think it was it was either Clinton or Bush who was bombing. So my dad went out to the streets to find the protest against the bombing because, you know, my dad's heard about America, that Americans always protest when our government starts bombing other countries. And he was really disappointed to find out that Americans didn't care and weren't protesting. And I think that long term set a spark in my family that they sort of had to take initiative and take us to protests and stuff. So I grew up, you know, going to the anti-occupation rallies, going to, you know, from when I was 5, like my first protest memory, I was 5. And I grew up, you know, seeing the images of war, of refugees, of, you know, this sort of colonization, devastation, especially that influenced, you know, the Middle Eastern Arabs. And, you know, we protested. We would go and my parents would, you know, chant and yell, and, you know, not after 9/11 happened and people hated Arabs and Muslims and people were advocating for bombing Arab countries. I remember vividly, you know, I'm this kid, elementary school kid, and I'm seeing other elementary school kids like across the street from me in the pro-war rallies saying nuke Iraq, all this other stuff. And like in my head, I'm like, no, we can't nuke Iraq. Like I have friends who are from Iraq. Like you know, they're family friends who are from Iraq. We can't do that to them. Like that's unacceptable. And like it's just sort of this like, I guess I grew up with this, and also there's this like pure hatred after 9/11. Like everyone sort of says 9/11 united America. For Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, that did not happen at all. All of a sudden we went from being American to somehow not being American. I grew up in Alabama, so they were already racist, so I didn't really ever have that not being American transition, but it went from them not knowing where I'm from and them being confused about my racial identity to them hating me. So it was sort of that was my transition. So, you know, I grew up Arab American, Egyptian American in Alabama, had to face racism, had to face all that. So I always had this sort of like And my parents organized protests, so I can see, mainly my mom, so I could see like my mom organize protests, organize interfaith panels with Jewish Americans, Hindu Americans, sort of like bring out, fight against, through education, through bringing people together, through activism and protesting, through panel discussions. So this was sort of something I always grew up with. When I sort of came into my own was during the Egyptian Revolution. So to those who don't know, Egypt, January 25th, 2011, Egypt rose up against its dictator, Hosni Mubarak, in a part of the Arab Spring. And, this was sort of a known thing in Egypt that something's going to happen. Before that, there's like the hush whispers in Egypt of the second revolution is coming, the first revolution referring to when we kicked out the British. So there's this reference to the second revolution's coming, and then all of a sudden a revolution happened, and I put on the sign support the Egyptian Revolution, and I walked around Ohio State campus with that. I'd go to class with it. I'd go to the gym with it. I organized support rallies, and I was a freshman at the time, but that got me really into the community, and also like other activist groups and whatnot. And so that's sort of how I got into organizing myself, as opposed to sort of going along with the protests that my family organized or would take me to.
Yeah, I really appreciate having spent time with your family and gotten to know like your sister in particular, just this real bridge between the academic knowledge that your family has really built up, and then just like always grounding it in the communities that you belong to. I feel like that's it just makes perfect sense that this is the way things should go, But having seen that that's not the way that we've approached even science and the way that we generate knowledge, and that there is this constant fight for democracy. And I think it's something that until particularly when a lot of these movements like Women's March, March for Science, were these reactionary moments to the election of former President Donald Trump, that was kind of like a reckoning, right? That democracy can be under attack. And it's only when it's like, even with Asian Americans right now, we're seeing it, right? There's like always been subtle signs that this is something that is very fragile, that these systems are not in place for everyone to benefit from. But it's only when the attacks become overt that people really start to respond. But then I think even for me, as you know, like even with my own political opinions, I had always kind of separated before then this identity, like my scientific identity and then my political identity. But when we got to know each other, really seeing you just like, with your t-shirts and the way that you just like vocally bring things up when you're at class or having lunch, just like integrating all of these and bring like your whole self into that scientific space was something that I really admired, which is why when March for Science was announced, which was literally just a Facebook event that you and I saw, I think like over winter break.
You saw it before me.
Yeah, you were
saw
the
it before me. You were like, "Oh, did you hear about March for Science?" And I was just like, "Wait, what?"
I think I texted you like right at the very early like New Year's or sometime around that. I was reading it the other day and I was like, "Want to go to this with me?" And we had no idea what to expect. But then it really snowballed. I think what was really heartening for me was like when you and I decided to go together, then you were like, okay, why don't we ask our friends to go together, like in the department, which our cohort at NYU was like 8 people. So it was like a small group when we were all friends by second semester at this point. And then it just became, I think, even more of an experience when we realized that we weren't even the only department and then school organizing to be part of this, like what turned out to be, something very dear to us, but this really huge event that I don't think either of us walking into it expected to be that day. But yeah, what was your experience like going into it when I approached you about attending?
So I already felt that something needed to happen, because my first, I guess, reckoning of science is under attack was during the Muslim ban. So like first week of Trump in office, I got sick when I saw, like I had I forgot what I had, but I had like something really important that I had to do. So I was in lab on Saturday working, and I just felt sick. And so I took the train and went towards JFK. Was like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just heading that way. And then I found pretty much all of New York was heading towards JFK. I didn't know there was a protest plan there. I was just going. I didn't know what to do at that point. And it turns out that that feeling was mutual across all of New York City. And we all just sort of went towards JFK to, I guess, liberate the people. And that's, what we did. But, I go in, I'm going back to lab like a few hours later after chanting, after, yelling, after letting out some steam, when I get this email saying they need translators inside JFK. My friends are lawyers. I know that you're probably there, from like an acquaintance from undergrad. She like found my email. She shot me an email. She was like, please go back. Please, if you're in JFK, they need you in Terminal 4. So I was on my way out of JFK. I was like taking the air train out. I go back in. The police had the air train surrounded on the other side. Like, you left, you're not coming back in. So I go back in, and the officers weren't letting me into the lawyers area. And I tell them like, oh, I'm, with the lawyers. And then eventually I find an officer who like kind of looks like he's, the people who kind of look like they're full of themselves. So I found an officer that looked like he's super full of himself, and I was like, you're the type of guy who's gonna fix this for me. We're just trying to get through this day, right? And so let's get through this day together. Let's figure this out together. The lawyers asked for me to be here to translate, so I'm here to translate. None of us really want to be here. Let's do this together. And I really appreciate all the work that you're doing today. I kissed his ass so goddamn. Went in. There were scientists being detained. There were scientists' families standing there because their parents are being detained and their parents are being detained. There were children being detained. Like, when I saw that and I saw this, racial attack, this, xenophobic attack was also attacking the scientific community, I felt gutted. I felt that every part of my community is under attack and that I couldn't do anything about it. When the March for Science, and I was there for 18 hours. I don't know how to explain to you any other way other than when I was coming back up the elevator going home, I cried in the elevator so hard that I couldn't get out of it. I cried so hard I vomited when I got home. It was seeing elderly people detained for 18 hours without food, without medicine, without a bed, without care. When we call them as their lawyers to translate, the Border Patrol would shut the phone on us because the president said so. I realized that democracy was under attack at that point. There was a Libyan woman there who basically said, what's happening right now. These white people don't know what's happening right now, but that there's going to be a coup soon. She like pretty much flat out said it. She said it pretty much week one that there was a coup going to happen. And I wish I kept in touch so that 4 years later when the insurrection happened, we can, I can say you're right, but I knew it. So when you told me that March for Science is developing, that, there's this movement of scientists to fight for it, I knew I had to bring my A game in. I actually, when I came in there, I knew I had to figure out who's running March for Science, and I had to make it about my causes. So I came in with the full intention of doing that. And I guess that's also, I think you realized that in the beginning too, because as soon as you realized, you were like, oh, let's organize Tandon. You told me let's organize Tandon to get in there. And you're like, how do you organize a school? And we just went through power structures. We went through how to organize a school. We found, we made such a fuss that other people who were organizing contacted us. We coordinated with them. We had the issue of coordinating our space, and then later on when we found out the March for Science New York City had dissolved, because we're not actually the first March for Science New York City. There was a loose coalition for March for Science New York City, and they dissolved. My immediate response was, we're March for Science New York City now. That was
Yeah, I've always
intention of taking over this movement. Like, I had full intention of this movement being about racial justice, climate justice, and democracy, and I was not going to let it be about raising funds for the sciences. Like, that was not in any of my intention at all. So yeah, that was, I guess, meant a lot to me.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I feel like you brought such an important lens, like even to the spaces. I think like when we first attended the March for Science, right, we all knew that we were there to stand up for science, but what that meant was really broad for everyone who was there, right? Like you just came with your personal experience. I have my own personal experience that motivated me to go, and so did the like hundreds of thousands of other people around the world who rallied that day. And I think when we had the opportunity to mold what that could look like in the city, especially knowing that it does look different everywhere, the voice that you brought talking about what it means to be Muslim in America, a scientist in America, all of this was really, really inspiring for a lot of people. Because I remember that day when we had first started having these conversations, there was these camps, right? Of like, you know, like science is science and science is not political. It should not be politicized, but there are reasons that we are here to like educate people about science. But we know, and March for Science knows, that science is political, full stop. And I think that really having, especially I think that's thrust comes from like younger scientists, like scientists who've been involved with organizing, scientists from marginalized communities who have always been advocates for ourselves and in our spaces, really push the movement towards this conversation of science and justice. And I think, yeah, seeing our work grow in that way has been something. I know I said it before, but it's just the way that needs to be. I think like using science, I always say this to you, right? Like seeing science as a framework for justice rather than just as like, you know, like I study calculus at school and I study chemistry at school and then I make these solar cells, I go home.
Like, yeah, these camps were competing though for the March for Science movement. What really was uplifting about the March for Science movement was it wasn't just me and you. You know, it was simultaneously across the entire movement. The movement sort of there's a massive push, and it was a fight. So like the identity of the March for Science movement, what it is today, of this organization that fights for justice, that uses science to fight for justice, that didn't happen just by chance. That it didn't start this way. It started with two competing camps, and I think the side of good won. But it and like I actually want to ask you, how did it feel? You know, you are Asian American. You have faced you grew up as an Asian in America. How did March for Science sort of touch your identity, and how did you feel the need when you saw that there were these two competing camps? Why did you feel the need to make sure that sort of the justice side of things won?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a lot. I'm trying to think how to word it.
I know you're supposed to be interviewing me. I know this, but I need you can't really tell the story of my involvement with March for Science without people knowing your story, because you're my co-chair, my co-founder.
Yeah, so yeah, for me, like, so yeah, I'm Filipino American, and in my family, education was just always at the forefront of what we prioritize. And I kind of had this background where I went to study engineering, knowing that it was I think in a lot of ways, a stable. You know, as someone pursuing my PhD, have come to love and really enjoy having pursued. But always this notion of growing up, like knowing that if material conditions were better in the Philippines, and still even were better in the Philippines, that maybe this life that I'm living, and this very privileged life that I've been able to live, would not be the way that it is. And there's always been this kind of like, you know, I am Asian American, so in a lot of ways have always been elevated to this like model minority status, right? Like expected to be really good at math. I did pursue engineering and science and kind of fitting into this mold. And then there's a stereotype of the Asian American woman, right? Which is like quiet, really subdued, not opinionated. And it's like, okay, so which one am I supposed to be? Really excelled and really like just like killing it at what I'm doing? Or am I supposed to be in the background? Or am I supposed to be doing these both and just capping out, right? And I think like growing up, I actually grew up in Jersey, which was like very diverse. I grew up around like a lot of Asian Americans, a lot of Filipino Americans. And I think that really siloed me from a lot of these issues. But as I came up into academia, particularly in the research world, that's when I started to see like how not just how my identity in particular is played against other marginalized identities, and also how my identity is just I don't know the right word for it, like used in ways are to perpetuate further injustices, right? And that's when I realized that I just can't be, even if we're all operating under this, that there needs to be, like you said, there are people who are always pushing back, and it's about using the privileges that I do have in these spaces to elevate voices, which I think you and I felt really important when we were organizing the initial March for Science group, especially protecting like younger students, undergrads who didn't feel like they could speak up to PIs in their spaces, grad students who felt like their funding was under attack, where you and I already had like PhD candidacy, so we kind of felt more secure in our spaces, to really move the movement in that way and build up that aspect of it. Because I feel like, yeah, at some point it's just like, you can't just be like expecting me to produce this data, expecting you to produce this data all the time, and not really thinking about the scientist as a person rather than just like this. And also the fact that, and we can talk about this more because this is something that you and I have been talking about a lot lately, what it even means to be doing science like in this framework. Like we talk about science, and this is something that I don't remember if you were the first person to bring it up or if we just had these conversations about how there is inherent biases in science, and that just because it's like data, just because it's peer reviewed, doesn't mean that the system is fair in a way, right? We know like we basically know like who gets to do research, what research is funded, all the way down to that. And that to me, I think, yeah, having been a part of it these past couple of years of grad school really pushed me to bring those conversations to the forefront when it comes to organizing for science.
Yeah. Absolutely. I do have one correction though. Our funding was under attack. If you remember the tax plan that was going to tax us on both our tuition and our salary. So if people don't know, the 2017 tax plan, although it's called a tax cut for billionaires, was supposed to be a tax hike for grad students. They're going to tax us on both our salary and our tuition remission. So we were going to be taxed more than what we make.
What we take home.
Yeah, so like it would have been a we mobilized in the streets. We organized with the graduate student union. I think that was actually our connection to the graduate student union at the time. Yeah, we coordinated with all the other, and this was before like March for Science kind of happened, and at that point we still hadn't solidified ourselves that we are the March for Science movement in New York City. At that point, we were just two grad students who showed up to one activist event and are ready to show up to the next. And so that was sort of that was also a realization that we need to be the ones who organize this, because we tried reaching out to the March for Science New York City collective at that point, and there was nobody responded. So yeah, there's a lot of moments in the beginning that were rough that like this movement did start as reactionary, but we did build it into we did create a constitution, have a background, values, a team, and the team is largely you're doing, and it's a lot of it. The March for Science movement was an interesting activist experience for me.
I think the number one thing I learned from you and like experience was like how much organizing is actually just like taking that leap of faith to send an email. Like if you're watching at home and like that like dreadful feeling when you're like writing an email to your professor about like an assignment and you're just like typing it with like perfect grammar, you're like so nervous, you don't know what's gonna happen, and they text you back K. This is like what it's like asking people to volunteer for stuff. 90% of the time there's gonna be someone who's just like, K, I'm showing up, I'm gonna be there. And I think like I didn't realize that I could be that person sending that email until I really got involved, like working with you, working like with now our team, like Josh, Tiff, Gianna, Danica, everyone. Because I think when I saw that it was other scientists in these spaces, that's when I started to feel like, okay, like we are all doing this, like we're all in this together. But as you said, it definitely took time to build up. Like Omar had mentioned that there was an original group who organized a 2017 satellite march in New York City, where Omar and I had gone to the DC march actually. And when 2018 came around, that's when we decided to do a bit more local organizing, and having realized that that group had gone separate ways, but a lot of those folks are actually still very active in their own spaces within March for Science, just not organizing the event as a group, is when we started to really form what the March for Science New York City voice was. But that being said, what are some of the things that we've worked on or that we are working on right now that you're particularly excited about?
I'm particularly excited, like other than the infrastructure, I'm very excited. I really like organizational infrastructure. I know that's a very boring topic, but I really like it when you're able to sustain a movement. People can come in, hear about you, you're growing, you're recruiting more people. It's starting to hit this sort of like it's a living being, and you are kind of managing it as opposed to you're dragging something along. So that's what I'm most excited about. But you know what we're doing, I'm really excited about our Get Out the Vote efforts. For the mayoral elections. I'm really excited about all these partnerships. I'm really excited about climate justice workshops for high schoolers around the city. I'm excited for a lot of that we're doing that's coming up. What are you most excited about?
Yeah, I'm super excited about all of this. But one of the big things is, the continuing like abolition climate justice workshops that we started with Key Williams, who was like our kind of like abolition parent when he brought this to the virtual stage last year, and that we've continued with One Freedom. I think like one of the big benefits about going virtual is like, one, I know that people watching this would be like, these people are excited about emails, they're excited about infrastructure, but it's really true. And I mean, one of the reasons we're able to have this conversation right now is because we have the capacity to like live stream. We have a platform that we're able to build this off of. And yeah, I'm like on the floor with my webcam right now. Omar's at home. But because of that, we've been able to reach a lot more people. And I think that just like growing that conversation, particularly around like climate, is something that as a chemi, I'm really excited about. But yeah, so
speaking of chemi,
yeah, let me know
a little bit about how your research ties into your excitement for this.
This is a double interview.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you're getting. I'm taking over the interview. That's.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question, and I'd love to know too, because we have similar academic backgrounds. Taking it back to like your personal journey. So, as a chemical engineer, chemical engineering has such a broad reach, right? It's consumer products, which is like how we get our drugs, how we get our food, how we get the materials for our clothing. It's also how we get our energy. And going into chemi, didn't really think about energy problems so much. But when I had the experience myself of working in a pilot plant where I was surrounded by ovens that were like 200 degrees Celsius, and it's like dead heat of summer, and even with the doors open, me wearing like the least amount of like PPE that I can safely, basically my lab coat and my gullet, just like not overheat.
The green lab coat? The thermal lab coat?
It was just a normal lab coat. It was just
I had a thermal lab coat when I worked metals.
Yeah. And that's when I was kind of thinking about, like, I think more personally, like, there is so much heat in this room. Like, why do we not do something about this? And that's when I started to really educate myself about, like energy and waste heat. And when, as you know, like working in with my PI now, how nanotechnology can really move us towards more effective ways of dealing with our energy issues. But yeah, how about for you? Yeah, I'm curious because you had like a material science background, right? Going into.
Yeah, I took material science, you take material selection, you learn about like materials life cycles and stuff like that. And then they taught us about, I think it was like when they taught us about recycling, and they taught us about like essentially how we have the technology to go fully green. We have the technology to actually be able to recycle 100%. We don't have the funds to do it. It was sort of like this click of, oh, this is a political issue. Like, they're just not paying for us to have a livable planet. And it wasn't like an intentional thing or any of that. It was just sort of like, here's the technology that exists. Here's the resources that exist. We can actually recycle all of it. And we can reuse all of it. It just materials like thermoplastics. I know there are materials that you cannot reuse in a certain way. They're like, oh, but you can grind it up and put it in tires and like sort of make it as asphalt. And so there's this like conversation about materials use, materials life cycle, cradle to grave materials, like how when you're harvesting it to when you're putting it back. There's a conversation about materials ethics that really intrigued me about sort of the conversation was about sort of if you have a material that you're taking it and it's a conflict material, but it's used for a good cause, then is it, you know, if you're getting lithium, but the lithium is from a conflict source and you're putting it in a battery that's a hard, like, is that good? And like that, these sort of realizations of how the global economy works, how the global economy is not working the way it should work, and how it can work better. We just don't have to do this. And like I'm already thinking about these things. So it's sort of, it clicks for me, like this my field and my activism clicked later on and when I was learning material science. But I actually separate my research from my activism. So I see my research as this happy place where I can just explore science. Because I'm very fundamental. So I do non-photochemical laser-induced nucleation, or basically I shoot lasers to make crystals. These crystals can be used for solar cells. They can be used for pharmaceuticals. They can be used to do good things. And that's something that gives me comfort, is that, you know, my investigation can be used for good things. However, my research itself is not, the purpose for my research itself is because I find real joy in it. It's really fun for me. And the fact that it has a better purpose just makes me happy. It's not like it's I see that I have to be an activist no matter what. And I guess for so long, I don't see my job as, or like what I do at work being related to that. But it's recently with March for Science is starting to mix more. Like and this is without my intention. You know, my the vertical farming class that I built in the base. So I built a vertical farm in the basement of the engineering school with some friends, and then I turned that into a class. And one of the things I wanted to teach students is materials life cycle, proposal writing, sustainability and design, things that as a material scientist I should be teaching anyway. But then on top of that, I realized, oh wait, I need to give it that one extra step, and I made it extra credit for my students to get involved in registering people to vote, volunteering at activist things, going to panel discussions, becoming more worldly. And that was something that it bled in. It wasn't fully intentional. It's just, this is my philosophy in sciences and in life, and that's how it got into my work.
I think that's a great point. I don't think a lot about how March for Science has impacted my research and like the way I think about my engineering career, but really like the activism work that we have done really has shaped the way that I think about science. Like we had talked about, like bringing conversation of like abolition and liberation into like our frameworks as scientists, or even just like the curriculum that we try to build with our students, right? I'm just curious. I have one more question for you before we have to start to wrap up. But what advice would you give someone who wants to get involved with activism, whether it's a student who might be a little bit hesitant about going to a protest, or someone who just doesn't know where to find information?
There are 2 points that I want to really highlight. First one, you can start small. Just email them. Be like, hey, do you need a volunteer for something coming up? Hey, do you guys have a special need that you want? And you'd be surprised. You even include your resume also when you say that, because sometimes we don't know we have that special need, and then you have like, you know, HTML and CSS, and we're like, oh yeah, we've been neglecting our website, which is true. Please reach out to March for Science New York City if you can help us out with our website. But then also, for activists, especially young activists, remember to care for yourselves. Remember that you're in this with a team, and that sometimes you have to step in for a team member, and sometimes a team member has to step in for you. Don't burn yourself out. Don't neglect your grades. Don't neglect your job. Don't neglect what you need to do to become an activist, because it's a long haul. This is a marathon. So don't burn yourself out right away. And I say this because, you know, we didn't get to this point now where we're both about to defend our PhD because we were always on. there are times in which Ingrid has had to step back and I've stepped in and the team stepped in. Right now, I actually have to step back and Ingrid and the team step forward and like put it all together because my thesis, my defense is due and my thesis is up like next week. And so rely on your team. Don't burn yourself out. And if you want to just get in, a simple email with your resume and we will find something to do because we're always understaffed and overworked and we always need help.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add to that is just, yeah, having an important support network, a strong support network is like so important. Like I'd mentioned before, like I think just starting with your friend is one way to go about it. Like Omar has, again, like we were just classmates, literally taking thermo together, first year of grad school, over conversations, realized we had these common interests, and I had no idea that we would be becoming satellite organizers within the next year. But having someone support and ally in spaces that can help advocate and elevate your voice is really important. And it'll come with time. But Omar, yeah, that's why, of course, it's so lovely as usual to talk to you. I'm really grateful to have this space to share with you as usual. And for those of you who are at home, if you'd like to learn more about March for Science New York City, where can they find you?
Email us. So email us at info@marchforscience.nyc. If you, again, we need help in a lot of different ways. Our team is always growing, especially our website. I think that's my biggest failure is I promised that we'd figure out a website, we'd have a better website, but I just, so please, reach out to us, send us your resume. There's a lot that we need done and a lot of different things. And there's some things that we don't even know we need done that you can help us out with. We have infrastructure for that. So please reach out to us and we really appreciate all that you can do.
All right. Thanks, Omar. Happy Friday.
Thanks, Ingrid. Happy Friday. Happy Earth Day. Or Happy Earth Week. Okay, we're done.